The Winchester rifle in Abigail Porter's hands trembled as she aimed it at the stranger approaching her homestead, the setting sun casting long shadows across the Nebraska plains. She hadn't shot a man in 15 years, but heaven help her, she would do it again if this drifter meant her or her property any harm. "That's far enough," she called out, her voice carrying on the evening breeze. "State your business or turn around." The man halted his bay horse, raising his hands slowly to show he carried no weapon. His face was partially obscured by the wide brim of his hat, but she could make out a strong jawline peppered with several days' worth of stubble. "Madam, I mean no trouble," he replied, his voice deep and steady. "Name's Dawson Reid. I'm looking for work, heard you might need help with your place." Abigail didn't lower the rifle. At 42, she'd spent the last decade alone on this homestead after her husband Thomas died of fever, leaving her with a modest cattle operation and more work than one person could handle. She'd managed, barely, through sheer determination and occasional help from passing cowhands. "Who told you I needed help?" she asked suspiciously. "Station master in town, said the Porter place could use an extra hand." He paused, then added, "Said the widow who runs it is too proud to ask." Abigail bristled at the description but couldn't deny its accuracy. The drought had made this summer particularly difficult, and winter would be worse if she couldn't get the remaining cattle properly situated. Still, taking on a stranger was risky. "I can't pay much," she said, finally lowering the rifle slightly, "and I don't need charity." The man Dawson nodded respectfully. "Not offering charity, madam, just honest work for fair pay." She studied him more carefully. His clothes were worn but clean, his saddle well maintained. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. Despite his trail-worn appearance, there was something in his eyes, a clear, steady gaze that met hers directly. "You got references?" she asked. "Worked 3 seasons at the Diamond Bar Ranch up in Wyoming. Before that, drove cattle from Texas to Kansas twice. Can handle horses, cattle, and any repairs you need." Abigail considered her options. The north pasture fence needed mending, the barn roof had a leak, and she'd lost 2 calves last week to coyotes because she couldn't be everywhere at once. Pride was one thing, foolishness was another. "1-month trial," she said finally. "You can sleep in the bunkhouse, it's empty but serviceable. First sign of trouble, you're gone," he nodded, the ghost of a smile crossing his face. "Yes, madam, thank you. And don't call me madam, makes me feel ancient. Name's Abigail Porter." "Miss Porter," he corrected himself, tipping his hat. "Mrs.," she replied automatically, though the title felt increasingly hollow with each passing year. As Dawson Reid dismounted and led his horse toward the small stable, Abigail wondered if she'd just made a terrible mistake. But watching him move with purpose, already assessing the property with a practiced eye, she felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time: relief at not having to shoulder every burden alone. Little did she know that the arrival of this quiet cowboy would challenge more than just her independence. It would shake the very foundations of the life she'd resigned herself to living. The next morning arrived with the harsh brilliance of late summer, sun already blazing across the eastern horizon as Abigail stoked the cookstove. She'd risen before dawn out of decades-old habit, expecting to be the first one moving about the property. To her surprise, she spotted Dawson Reid through the kitchen window, already examining the damaged corral where one of her horses had broken through 2 days prior. By the time she'd prepared a simple breakfast of cornbread and coffee, he had not only repaired the corral but was now splitting logs for firewood, his rhythmic movements efficient and practiced. Abigail watched him for a moment, noting the breadth of his shoulders and the way he worked with methodical precision. She guessed him to be in his mid-30s, though the western sun had weathered his face, making it difficult to be certain. She stepped onto the porch, calling across the yard. "Breakfast if you want it." He looked up, wiping sweat from his brow with a bandana. "Appreciate it." At the table, he ate with the measured pace of a man accustomed to savoring what might be his only decent meal of the day. Abigail poured coffee for them both, trying to remember the proper etiquette of hosting a hired hand. It had been years since anyone had sat at her table. "The north pasture needs attention today," she said, falling back on practicality. Fence is down in 3 places and I've got 8 head that keep wandering into Peterson's alfalfa. Dawson nodded. Saw the gaps yesterday when I rode in. I can have it fixed by sundown. You'll need help. I'll come with you after I tend to the chickens and garden. He glanced up from his coffee. I can manage it. I didn't hire you to do everything yourself, Mr. Reid, she said firmly. I hired you to make the work manageable. There's a difference. A slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Fair enough, and it's just Dawson, if you don't mind. Dawson, then. They worked together through the morning, falling into an unexpected rhythm. Abigail was surprised at how quickly they established a wordless communication. She'd hand him a tool just as he reached for it, or he'd brace a fence post exactly when she needed support. By midday, they'd repaired 2 of the 3 breaks in the fence, working far faster than she could have alone. As they paused under the shade of a cottonwood tree for lunch cold cornbread and dried apples, she'd packed in a cloth. Abigail found herself studying her new hand. His hands were calloused and strong, but his touch was careful when it needed to be. He spoke little but observed everything, those eyes missing nothing. How long have you been on your own here? He asked, breaking the comfortable silence. 10 years since Thomas passed, she replied. Had help on and off, but mostly managed alone. It's a lot of land for one person, she bristled slightly. I've done fine. Didn't say you haven't, he replied evenly, just noting it's a challenging piece of property. Abigail softened. Thomas and I came here in 51. Had dreams of building something lasting. He was going to add rooms to the house, maybe plant an orchard. She looked away across the rolling prairie. Dreams change, I suppose, or wait, Dawson said quietly. She turned back to him, surprised by the gentle understanding in his expression. We should finish before the day gets any hotter, she said, rising to her feet and brushing crumbs from her skirt. They completed the fence repairs by mid-afternoon. As they rode back to the homestead, Abigail pointed out various features of her property, the spring that never ran dry, even in drought. The place where lightning had struck last summer, splitting an ancient oak. The small family cemetery where Thomas lay beside the infant son who had lived only 3 days. Dawson listened attentively, asking occasional questions that revealed his knowledge of ranching and land management. When they reached the house, he surprised her by saying, Your roof needs attention before winter. The southwest corner is sagging. I've noticed, she admitted. It's on my list. I can start on it tomorrow if you've got the materials. I have some lumber in the shed. Been saving to hire someone from town, but no need, he interrupted. Basic carpentry's part of cowboy life. That evening, after a supper of beans and salt pork, Abigail sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. She heard Dawson's footsteps before she saw him, emerging from the bunkhouse freshly washed, his damp hair combed back from his forehead. Mind if I join you? He asked. She gestured to the empty chair beside her. They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the chorus of cicadas and distant coyotes. Beautiful land you have, he finally said. It is, she agreed. Harsh sometimes, but beautiful. What made you stay? After your husband passed, I mean. The question was direct but not impertinent, asked with genuine curiosity. Abigail considered her answer carefully. Where else would I go? This is my home. Every fence post, every acre Thomas and I worked for it together. She traced a worn spot on the porch railing with her finger. Besides, starting over at my age seemed harder than just continuing on. You're hardly ancient, Dawson observed with a slight smile. Old enough to know some chances don't come twice, she replied. The next weeks fell into a pattern. They rose early, worked through the day's tasks together, and occasionally sat on the porch in the evenings, talking or simply sharing silence. Abigail found herself watching Dawson when he wasn't looking, the precise way he moved, the rare but transformative smile that would sometimes break through his reserved demeanor. He repaired the roof, reinforced the chicken coop against predators, and helped bring in the small kitchen garden harvest. When a pair of wolves began stalking her remaining cattle, he tracked them for 2 days before successfully driving them away from her property without having to shoot them. Most would have killed them, she remarked when he returned. Dawson shrugged. They're just trying to survive, same as us. Besides, they were here first. Something about his gentle understanding of the harsh world around them touched Abigail deeply. It reminded her of Thomas in some ways, that balance of strength and compassion, but Dawson was his own man. Quieter, more watchful, with depths she was just beginning to glimpse. One evening in early October, a letter arrived from the railroad company, delivered by a young man from town who'd ridden out specifically to bring it. Abigail read it with growing concern while Dawson prepared supper. It was his turn, an arrangement they'd fallen into naturally. Problem. He asked, noticing her expression. Railroad wants to buy a corner of my land, she explained, for their new spur line to the mines north of here. And you don't want to sell, it's good pastureland, and, she hesitated, Thomas is buried there. Dawson set down the wooden spoon he was using to stir the stew. They can't force you. Maybe not yet, but they have ways. She folded the letter carefully. They're offering enough money to see me through a few lean years, I'll give them that. What will you do? I don't know, she admitted. Decisions like this were easier when they weren't just mine to make. After supper, they sat by the fire as the autumn evening turned chilly. Abigail found herself telling Dawson about her early years with Thomas, their journey west from Pennsylvania, the difficult first winters, the son they'd lost, and the daughter who'd been stillborn 2 years later. After that, we stopped hoping for children, she said quietly, staring into the flames, focused on building the ranch instead. And you did, Dawson replied. It's a fine piece of land, well managed. For what purpose, though? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Who am I preserving it for? Dawson considered this. Does there need to be a who? Isn't the land itself worth preserving? She looked at him, surprised by his perspective. I suppose that's true. I just sometimes wonder what Thomas would think of me now, still here, just existing. I think he'd be proud, Dawson said simply. You've kept his dream alive. Our dream, she corrected. Though I'm too old for dreams now, Dawson studied her face in the firelight. Then let me dream them for you. The words hung in the air between them, laden with meaning neither was ready to fully acknowledge. Abigail felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. For the first time in years, she was acutely aware of herself as a woman, not just a widow or a rancher. It's getting late, she said, rising abruptly. We should both get some rest. That night, alone in the bed she'd once shared with Thomas, Abigail lay awake for hours, thinking of Dawson's words and the look in his eyes when he'd spoken them. She wondered what dreams he might hold for her land, for her future for them, perhaps. The thought both terrified and exhilarated her. The following days brought a strange tension between them. They worked together as efficiently as ever, but Abigail found herself hyper-aware of every accidental touch, every shared glance. Dawson, too, seemed more careful around her, as though afraid of overstepping an invisible boundary. When the first autumn storm blew in from the mountains a week later, they were forced to take shelter in the barn while checking on a pregnant heifer. Rain hammered the roof as wind howled through the gaps in the wooden walls. Abigail wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, watching Dawson calm the nervous animal with gentle words and a steady hand. She'll be fine, he assured her. First calf, but she's strong. How do you know so much about cattle? Abigail asked, grateful for the conversation to distract from the storm and from her unsettling awareness of their isolation together. Dawson smiled slightly. Grew up on a ranch in Texas. My father raised longhorns. I was helping with calving by the time I was 10. What happened to the ranch? His expression darkened. War came. I enlisted in '62. By the time I made it back in '65, my father was dead and the ranch had been sold for taxes. He stroked the heifer's flank absently, never quite managed to settle anywhere permanent after that. I'm sorry, Abigail said softly. The war took so much from so many. It did, he agreed, but life continues. New beginnings are possible. The way he looked at her as he said it made her breath catch. The storm raged outside, but in the warm, hay-scented darkness of the barn, something fragile and new was taking shape between them. Abigail, he began, taking a step toward her. Before he could continue, the barn door burst open, bringing a gust of wind and rain and a stranger, stumbling in from the storm. "Hello, the barn," the man called, water streaming from his oilskin coat. "Sorry to intrude, but my horse threw a shoe and I saw your light." Dawson moved protectively to Abigail's side as the stranger pushed back his hat, revealing a middle-aged face with sharp, assessing eyes. "Name's Elliot Burke," the man said. "Representative of the Western Pacific Railroad. Mrs. Porter, I presume." "I was planning to call on you tomorrow, but the storm hastened my arrival." Abigail straightened her spine. "You're the one who sent the letter about my land." "Indeed." Burke smiled, his teeth flashing white in the lantern light. "And I've come to negotiate personally. The company is quite eager to acquire that parcel." "As I wrote in my reply, Mr. Burke, I'm not interested in selling." Burke's smile didn't waver. "Perhaps we could discuss this over shelter and a hot meal. I'm authorized to offer considerably more than what was in that letter." Hospitality demanded she couldn't turn him away in such weather, regardless of his purpose. "You can stay in the bunkhouse tonight. Mr. Reid will show you the way once the storm lets up a bit." Burke's gaze shifted to Dawson, assessing. "Much obliged, and you are?" "Her foreman," Dawson replied simply, his posture tense. Burke looked between them with shrewd interest. "I see. Well then, shall we wait out the worst of it here?" The three of them remained in uncomfortable silence as the storm gradually subsided. When it was finally possible to venture out, Dawson led Burke to the bunkhouse, returning to the main house alone to find Abigail stoking the kitchen fire. "I don't trust him," Dawson said without preamble. "Nor do I," she agreed, "but I can handle railroad men. Just be careful. These companies have ways of getting what they want." The concern in his voice warmed her, even as worry about Burke's presence nagged at her. "I've managed this far on my own." "You're not on your own anymore," Dawson said quietly. The simple statement hung in the air between them, full of promise and complication. Abigail busied herself with the kettle, afraid to meet his eyes. "Thank you," she finally said, "for everything you've done here." "I haven't done it for thanks," he replied, his voice low. When she finally looked up, the intensity in his gaze made her heart race. For one breathless moment, she thought he might step forward, might bridge the gap between them. Instead, he nodded once and turned toward the door. "I'll keep an eye on our guest," he said. "Lock your door tonight." After he left, Abigail pressed her hands against the rough wooden table, steadying herself against the surge of emotions his presence had stirred. At 42, she'd thought such feelings long behind her, the quickened pulse, the awareness of every gesture and word. It was terrifying and wonderful all at once. She wondered what Thomas would think, seeing her now on the verge of opening her heart again. Would he understand? Would he approve? The answers weren't as clear as they once might have been, and that realization brought both guilt and a strange sense of freedom. Elliot Burke proved to be as persistent as he was unwelcome. Over breakfast the next morning, he laid out the railroad's new offer, double the original amount, plus assurances that the cemetery would remain untouched. "The line will run a respectful distance from your family graves, Mrs. Porter," he explained, spreading maps across her kitchen table. "We're not heartless." "My answer remains no," Abigail said firmly. "That land isn't for sale at any price." Burke's affable expression hardened slightly. "Mrs. Porter, I must be frank. The railroad is coming through this territory one way or another. If you won't sell voluntarily, there are other methods." "Are you threatening me, Mr. Burke?" Abigail asked, her voice dangerously calm. "Not at all," he replied smoothly. "Simply stating facts. The government has granted certain powers to the railroad companies for the greater good of national development." Dawson, who had been silently observing from the doorway, stepped forward. "Mrs. Porter has given you her answer. I think it's time you moved on." Burke gathered his maps unhurriedly. "I'll be in town for the week. Should you reconsider? Sometimes a bit of reflection reveals the wisdom of compromise." He tipped his hat. "Thank you for your hospitality." After he'd ridden away, Abigail slumped in her chair. "They're not going to take no for an answer, are they?" Dawson shook his head. "Not likely. Men like Burke are used to getting their way." "What would you do?" she asked, surprised by how much his opinion had come to matter to her. He considered the question carefully. "I'd talk to a lawyer in town, find out exactly what rights you have. And I'd make sure Burke understands you're not alone in this fight. Are you offering to stay?" The question emerged before she could consider its implications. "I am," Dawson replied simply, "if you'll have me." The way he said it, the depth of meaning behind those words, made her realize he was offering more than just help with her railroad problem. He was offering a future, a partnership she hadn't dared imagine might be possible again. "My month trial is nearly up," he added when she remained silent. "So it is," she managed, her throat suddenly dry, "and you've more than proven your worth." "Is that all I am to you?" A useful hand around the ranch, the directness of his question startled her. Abigail looked into his eyes, seeing the vulnerability beneath his steady gaze. "No," she admitted quietly, "that's not all you are." He took a step closer. "What am I then?" "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know what any of this is. I never expected, at my age." "Your age," he repeated, a hint of frustration coloring his voice. "Abigail, you talk as though your life is over. You're vibrant, strong, beautiful." "I'm 42, she interrupted. "You can't be more than 38, he supplied. "Hardly a boy." "Still, you could have anyone, a young woman who could give you children, a family." Dawson stepped closer still, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "If I wanted that, I wouldn't be here." His voice softened. "I've wandered for years, never finding a place that felt right, until now." Abigail's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must hear it. Part of her wanted to flee this conversation, this moment of vulnerability that threatened the careful shell she'd built around herself. But another part, a part that had been silenced for too long, wanted to lean into the possibility he represented. "I'm afraid," she confessed. "Of what?" "Of hoping again. Of dreaming." Dawson reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, he gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his calloused fingers brushing her cheek. "Then let me dream for both of us," he said. "For now." The tenderness in his touch, in his words, broke something loose inside her. Abigail closed her eyes, allowing herself to lean slightly into his hand. It had been so long since anyone had touched her with such care, such intention. The moment was interrupted by the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching. Abigail stepped back, composing herself as Dawson moved to the window. "Riders coming," he reported, 3 men. The visit from Burke's associates, for that was clearly who they were. Despite their claims to be merely surveying, set the tone for the coming weeks. The railroad's pressure increased, with Burke making repeated offers, each accompanied by thinly veiled warnings about what might happen if Abigail continued to refuse. True to his word, Dawson rode into town with her to consult the lawyer, who confirmed her worst fears. The railroad could potentially invoke eminent domain if they could persuade the territorial authorities that the line was essential for development. "It's not hopeless," the lawyer, a Mr. Peterson, assured her. "You have rights, but it will be an uphill battle, especially for a woman alone." "She's not alone," Dawson interjected firmly. Abigail glanced at him gratefully, drawing strength from his steady presence beside her. As autumn deepened toward winter, their days fell into a new routine. They worked the ranch together, prepared for the coming cold, and strategized how to counter the railroad's claims. In the evenings, they would often sit by the fire, talking long into the night. Abigail found herself sharing stories she hadn't told in years about her childhood in Pennsylvania, her dreams as a young woman, the journey west with Thomas. In turn, Dawson told her of his time in the war, serving with the Union cavalry, and his aimless years afterward, working ranches from Texas to Montana, never staying long in any one place. "Why did you keep moving?" she asked one night as the first snow fell softly outside. He stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. "After the war, I couldn't seem to fit anywhere. The fighting changes a man. Things that once seemed important didn't anymore, and things I'd never valued suddenly meant everything." "Like what?" "Peace," he said simply. "Quiet. A place where a man's word still matters." He looked up at her. "Someone to share it with who understands that some wounds don't show." The intimacy of these conversations deepened their connection, even as the physical distance between them remained carefully maintained. Dawson never presumed, never pushed, but Abigail felt the growing tension between them, a sweet, aching awareness that threatened to overflow every time their hands accidentally touched or their eyes met for too long. Winter settled in with unusual severity that year. Heavy snows isolated the ranch for days at a time, forcing them into closer proximity than ever. They worked together to keep the livestock fed and watered, to maintain the precious heat in the house, to stretch their supplies until the weather cleared enough for a trip to town. During one particularly fierce blizzard, they lost power in the bunkhouse when its small stove cracked in the extreme cold. Without discussion, Abigail made up a pallet for Dawson near the kitchen fireplace in the main house. That night, listening to his steady breathing from across the room, she found herself wondering what it would be like to have him closer still, to feel his arms around her, his body warming hers. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. It had been so long since she'd thought of herself as a woman with desires, needs that went beyond simple survival. Thomas had been gone a decade, and in that time she'd convinced herself that part of her life was over. Now, with Dawson under her roof, that conviction was crumbling. When the storm finally broke 3 days later, they emerged to find one of the yearling calves missing. Tracks in the fresh snow led toward the ridge that marked the eastern boundary of her property. Probably seeking shelter in the pine grove, Dawson said, already saddling his horse. "I'll find it. I'm coming with you," Abigail insisted, pulling on her heaviest coat. 2 sets of eyes are better than one. They rode out together, following the meandering trail left by the frightened animal. The world around them was transformed, familiar landmarks buried under pristine white, trees bowed beneath the weight of snow, the sky above a brilliant, aching blue. They found the calf sheltered in a small hollow beneath a fallen tree, cold and hungry but alive. While Dawson carefully extracted the animal, Abigail noticed a set of human tracks nearby, fresh from after the storm. "Someone's been here," she said, pointing out the footprints. Dawson secured the calf across his saddle before examining the tracks. "Heading toward your south pasture," he observed grimly, "where Burke wants to put his railroad." They followed the trail cautiously, eventually spotting 2 men hammering stakes into the ground, marking what appeared to be a survey line directly through Abigail's property. "Hey!" she called out, anger flaring. "You're trespassing!" The men looked up, startled. One reached instinctively toward his hip before seeming to think better of it when he spotted Dawson. "Just doing our job, madam," the taller one replied. "Railroad sent us to mark the preliminary route." "The railroad doesn't own this land," Dawson stated coldly. "Mrs. Porter hasn't sold it, and she doesn't intend to." "That's between her and Mr. Burke," the second man said with a shrug. "We just go where they tell us." "Well, I'm telling you to get off my property," Abigail declared, her voice firm despite the fear churning in her stomach. The audacity of it to simply act as though her refusal was a minor inconvenience to be ignored fueled her outrage. The men exchanged glances before the first one spoke again. "No disrespect intended, madam, but Mr. Burke said this is happening whether you like it or not. Said to tell you the governor's already approved the eminent domain order. It's just a matter of paperwork now." Abigail felt as though she'd been struck. Could it be true? Had Burke somehow managed to circumvent her rights so quickly? "Show me the order," Dawson demanded, his hand resting casually near his holstered pistol. "Don't have it with us," the second man admitted. "Burke's got the papers." "Then until I see official documentation, you're trespassing," Dawson stated, "and I suggest you leave now while you still can." There was something in his voice, a quiet, deadly certainty that made the men reconsider their position. After a tense moment, they gathered their equipment. "Burke won't like this," the taller one muttered. "That's between him and me," Dawson replied evenly. They watched as the men mounted their horses and rode away. Once they were out of sight, Abigail's composed facade crumbled. She slumped in her saddle, the weight of what was happening finally hitting her full force. "Can they really do this?" she asked, her voice small against the vast white landscape. "Take my land, Thomas's resting place, everything we built." Dawson moved his horse closer, reaching out to cover her gloved hand with his own. "Not if I have anything to say about it," he promised. "Burke is bluffing about the order. He's trying to intimidate you into selling." "What if he's not?" "What if then we'll fight him?" Dawson interrupted, his eyes fierce with determination. "Together." The conviction in his voice steadied her. Looking at him, this man who had walked into her life just months ago and somehow become essential to it, Abigail felt a surge of emotion so powerful it nearly took her breath away. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you fight for me for my land?" Dawson held her gaze, all pretense falling away. "Because I love you, Abigail. I think I have since that first evening on your porch watching the sunset paint your face golden." The words hung in the crystal air between them, impossible to take back, impossible to ignore. Abigail stared at him, her heart thundering in her chest. "You can't," she finally managed. "I can," he countered. "I do, and I think you might love me too if you'd allow yourself to." The calf, still secured to Dawson's saddle, bleated plaintively, breaking the tension of the moment. "We should get back," Abigail said, turning her horse toward home. "The calf needs warming." Dawson didn't push, simply nodded and followed her lead. But something had changed irrevocably between them, a truth spoken that could not be unheard. That night, after they'd settled the recovered calf with its mother in the barn, Abigail stood at her kitchen window, watching the moonlight transform the snow-covered yard into a silver dreamscape. She heard Dawson's footsteps behind her but didn't turn. "I meant what I said," he stated quietly. "But I won't speak of it again if it troubles you." She closed her eyes, gathering her courage before turning to face him. "It doesn't trouble me, it terrifies me." "Why?" "Because I've built walls around my heart for 10 years. I've convinced myself I was too old, too settled in my ways too damaged by loss to ever love again." She took a deep breath. "And then you arrived, and every day since, those walls have been crumbling, and I'm afraid of what happens when they're gone completely." Dawson stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "What are you afraid will happen?" "That I'll lose myself," she whispered. "That I'll love you and then lose you too, and this time I won't survive it." His expression softened with understanding. "Abigail," he said gently, "loving someone doesn't mean losing yourself. It means finding parts of yourself you thought were gone forever." The truth of his words resonated within her. Since his arrival, she had rediscovered joy in simple pleasures, the satisfaction of work shared, laughter over meals, conversations that stretched long into the evening. She had begun to dream again, to hope. "I'm too old for dreams," she said, but the protest sounded hollow even to her own ears. Dawson smiled, reaching out to take her hands in his. "Then let me dream them for you," he repeated, his earlier words now laden with even deeper meaning. This time, when he leaned forward, she didn't pull away. His lips met hers in a kiss so tender, it brought tears to her eyes, a kiss that promised understanding, patience, and a love that had come unexpectedly, but was no less powerful for its late arrival. When they finally parted, Abigail rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "What do we do now?" she asked. "About us, or about Burke and the railroad?" Both. Dawson's arms tightened around her. "For us, we take each day as it comes. For Burke." He paused. "I have an idea about that, but it will require a trip to the territorial capital." The following week brought both challenges and revelations. Dawson rode to Helena, the territorial capital, while Abigail held the fort at the ranch. During his absence, Burke arrived with what he claimed was an official order, only to find Abigail armed and resolute at her property line. "This paper isn't worth the ink it's printed on until I've had my lawyer examine it," she informed him coldly. "And I suggest you remove your surveyors from my land before they have an unfortunate accident." Burke's affable mask slipped, revealing the calculating man beneath. "Mrs. Porter, surely you understand your position is untenable. A woman alone—" "I'm not alone," she interrupted. "And you do well to remember that." 4 days later, Dawson returned with news that transformed their situation. Through connections from his Army days, he discovered that Burke had been operating under false pretenses. The railroad did indeed have plans for a spur line, but the approved route was actually 3 miles east of Abigail's property. "Burke's been trying to buy land cheaply to sell to the railroad at a profit," Dawson explained. "He has no authority to invoke eminent domain, and the document he showed you is a forgery." The revelation brought both relief and fury. With evidence of Burke's fraud in hand, they rode together to the sheriff's office in town. The resulting confrontation led to Burke's arrest. and the withdrawal of all railroad claims against Abigail's property. As they rode home together under a sky bright with winter stars, Abigail felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. The threat to her land was gone, but more than that, the future suddenly stretched before her, filled with possibilities she'd long since abandoned. "What happens now?" she asked as they approached the homestead, its windows glowing with welcoming light. Dawson looked at her, his expression serious yet hopeful. "That depends on you. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give." "And if I am ready?" she questioned softly. His smile then was like sunrise breaking over the prairie. "Then I'd ask you to marry me, Abigail Porter. To let me share your dreams and mine, to build something together on this land you love so much." They reined in their horses before the house, and Dawson dismounted first, reaching up to help her down. As her feet touched the ground, he kept his hands at her waist, looking down at her with such naked adoration that it stole her breath. "I'm afraid I'll disappoint you," she confessed. "I'm set in my ways, and I can't give you children." "I'm not asking for children," he replied. "I'm asking for you exactly as you are." The simplicity of it, the honesty in his eyes, broke through the last of her hesitation. Standing there in the snow with the home she'd built framing the moment, Abigail made her choice. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Yes, I'll marry you, Dawson Reid." His answering kiss was filled with promise of passion, of partnership, of a future neither had dared imagine until now. Spring arrived early that year, transforming the ranch with new life. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows, calves frolicked on strengthening legs, and throughout it all, Abigail and Dawson worked side by side, planning for their shared future. They were married on a perfect May morning, with just the preacher and a few neighbors as witnesses. Abigail wore a simple blue dress that matched her eyes, with wildflowers in her hair. Dawson, cleaned up and solemn in a new suit, watched her approach with wonder in his eyes, as though he still couldn't quite believe his good fortune. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," Abigail whispered as they stood together under the old oak tree where Thomas was buried. She had insisted on this spot, feeling somehow that it was right that Thomas would understand and approve of this new chapter in her life. "I never thought I'd feel this way at all," Dawson replied, squeezing her hands gently. "You've given me a home, Abigail, a purpose. And you've given me back my dreams," she said softly as the preacher began the ceremony. Their vows were simple but profound promises to honor, cherish, and support each other through whatever the future might bring. When the preacher finally pronounced them man and wife, Dawson's kiss was both tender and passionate, a seal on their commitment witnessed by the land they both loved. That evening, as they sat on the porch of what was now their home, watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors, Dawson took her hand in his. "Happy?" he asked, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. Abigail looked out at the ranch, at the new fence they'd built together, the repaired barn, the garden freshly planted with seeds for the coming season. Then she looked at the man beside her, whose patience and love had awakened parts of herself she'd thought lost forever. "More than happy," she replied. "Content, complete." Dawson smiled, lifting her hand to press a kiss against her knuckles. "Me too." As darkness settled over the prairie, they remained there, planning their future together, dreams of expanding the ranch, perhaps taking on a young family to train as helpers, creating a legacy that would outlive them both. Dreams that once had seemed impossible to Abigail now felt within reach, all because one determined cowboy had refused to let her believe her time for dreaming was past. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I've been thinking about that parcel to the west, the one with the year-round stream. It would be perfect for a small orchard. Like the one Thomas wanted to plant," Dawson asked gently. She nodded, grateful for his understanding, for the way he accepted Thomas's memory as part of who she was, not as a rival for her affections. "Yes, but with some differences. I was thinking apples, but also cherry trees. You mentioned once they were your favorite." "I did," he confirmed, surprise and pleasure evident in his voice. "You remembered that?" "I remember everything about you," she admitted. "Every story, every preference. Is that foolish at my age?" Dawson laughed softly, pulling her closer against the evening chill. There you go with at my age again. When will you accept that love doesn't care about birthdays? Probably never, she conceded with a smile. You'll just have to keep reminding me. Gladly, he promised. For the next 30 or 40 years, at least. The certainty in his voice, the casual assumption of decades together filled Abigail with a joy so intense it was almost pain. After years of careful solitude, of tamping down hopes and restricting dreams to what seemed practical and achievable alone, the expansiveness of a shared future was almost overwhelming. As stars emerged above them, Abigail rested her head against her husband's shoulder, thinking of all they would build together. The land would remain Thomas's legacy and now Dawson's too, but transformed by new vision, new energy. Not erasing the past, but building upon it, honoring what had been while embracing what could be. I love you, she said, words that had once seemed impossible to speak to anyone after Thomas, now flowing naturally from her heart. And I love you, Dawson replied, his voice carrying the depth of his commitment. Always will. In the years that followed, the Porter Reid Ranch flourished. They did plant that orchard, and when the first trees bore fruit 5 years later, they celebrated by inviting neighbors from miles around to share in the harvest. They took in a young widow and her 2 children as helpers, providing them with a home and purpose while gaining the family neither had expected to have. Abigail never did stop worrying that she was too old, too set in her ways, too something for the vibrant life she found herself living. But Dawson never stopped reassuring her, never ceased finding ways to show her that love recognizes no boundaries of age or circumstance. And on quiet evenings, they would still sit together on that porch, watching the sun sink behind the mountains, planning new dreams for their shared tomorrow. Dreams that had once seemed impossible, now made real through the power of a love that had arrived unexpectedly, but exactly when it was most needed. For Abigail Porter Reid had learned that it was never too late to dream, and that sometimes, the most beautiful dreams of all are those we allow others to dream alongside us.